welcome to the second part of my discussion on genre. This one I'm going to focus on video games. Now, I mentioned video games a little bit in my first video on this, which is my previous video. I'm going to link that in the description below. If you haven't watched that, I strongly suggest you go and watch that video first, because this is literally going to be a continuation of that discussion. Now, this is video game genre discussion. Now, that video I talked about genres more broadly. I focused more on literary genre and film genre, and using books and novels as the example, but I feel those genre labels do fit for video games. I believe that you can label most video games with those genres. Not all, but most. The thing is, I question if video games are even a medium of entertainment at all. Because I think the video games are way, way more than that. Video games are such a young medium of entertainment that I question if they are in fact one medium. Is video games one thing? Or is it multiple different things strung together vaguely because they happen to use the same devices? That they happen to have interactivity be a key part of them? I'm not sure that's enough to string them together. Someone who enjoys fighting games, for example, will have very little in common with someone who enjoys, say, a turn-based JRPG. And the fact that you know what I'm talking about is only based on convention, because I had to specify turn-based JRPG there, just to make sure that you understood what I was using as a reference point, because RPG has been so abused as a term. Another one that's been abused so frequently is the term action-adventure, which can be applied to almost any game out there. I think that video games started as a medium of entertainment, largely in the arcades and in very, very primitive games, things like Pong, Pac-Man, Space Invaders, things like that, that didn't require the same kind of categorization that we had in other mediums, like in film and in literature. And because it started out that way, the genre naming conventions have been completely screwed over. We now have genre names that are completely inadequate. First-person shooter is a genre in video games, but it tells you nothing of the genre. If I have a first-person shooter, that doesn't tell you if that first-person shooter is a war game, or a fantasy game, or a sci-fi, or a horror. It's unlikely to be a romance if it's a first-person shooter, but still. It doesn't actually tell you the genre, because genre, so far, has meant very specific things, and the labels have been largely consistent. Whether we're talking about a TV show, a film, a book, they've been largely consistent. Of course, music is another outlier. We'll get to music in a different video. But these outliers mean that we end up with categories that don't make sense. We end up with games that are being labelled based on no real meaning behind it. Some genre labels are based on the camera's perspective, like first-person shooter or top-down adventure. Others will be based on the limitations of the system, like turn-based RPG or text-based adventure, which is, again, just describing the system. But others are completely turned on the head, like survival horror, which would almost sound like we're going back to the literary styles of genre, where it says horror, but it's survival horror. So, is that doing what I'm about to suggest we do, which is combining a gameplay element with a traditional genre element? Survival, the gameplay element, and horror. Maybe that is the only real genre name that is actually doing what I would normally suggest. But we don't have survival action, or survival fantasy, or survival sci-fi. Only survival horror. And what about games that are clearly horror games, like Bloodborne, that are almost never defined as a horror game, but instead are placed in a different genre, often a genre named after another game, or named after itself, in this case, Soulsborne, which tells you nothing other than it's in the genre that it defined, which is a useless term, really. The same is true of platformers. Platformers have expanded and they've developed different methods, and now we've got Metroidvania, which is a genre named after two games, Castlevania and Metroid, which they've created this portmanteau. More than half the Castlevania games don't fit the genre that the genre the genre Metroidvania is. So even the Castlevania games aren't Metroidvanias. Same with the Metroid games. Half the Metroid games are first-person shooters. So the name is really, really frustrating. It doesn't tell you anything about it. Unless you understand the history of the genre already, it doesn't inform you anything. So the term is useless. Roguelike is another one. And then, on top of that, then there's the pretentious people who took roguelike and then defined it as needing to be very similar to Rogue, a game that no one played because it was an extremely niche game from really early on in gaming's infancy, so a few hundred people played it at most, and it's gone off into obscurity now, so anyone who says they've played Rogue, unless they're a hipster, they almost certainly haven't, including me. I haven't actually played Rogue. I've played, variations of it, but I haven't played the original Rogue. I wouldn't know where to find it, even if I wanted to. I've played some kind of browser variation of Rogue, I think. I've played games that are derivatives of Rogue, but I don't believe I've ever played the original Rogue. But anyway, that's beside the point. So then they took that, and then they decided that if it's not exactly like Rogue, it's not a roguelike anymore, it's a roguelite. So it's not roguey enough to be like Rogue. It's Diet Rogue, which just sounds like an insult, really. It just sounds like you're claiming that it's not really good enough. It's quasi-game, it's semi-game, not quite game enough. These genre names are pointless. They don't serve their purpose. There's the problem of the Spectacle Fighter, which I quite like the name the Spectacle Fighter. I thought it fit well enough. It described the act of fighting it didn't describe that it was third person, but it described the act of fighting, and the game is all about spectacle. So, spectacle fighting. I had no problem with that as a descriptor. Then someone decided character action was going to be replacing it as the name for the genre for this, that so far didn't have a collected genre name. And then all the news outlets started using that, all the gaming news outlets started using character action, which is the worst name ever for a genre, because what games don't have fucking characters and action in them? Mario games have Mario in them and he does things. That's character action. Character action is the worst possible name you could use. It tells you nothing. So yeah, genre naming convention in video games just makes no sense. So I've come to the conclusion, video games, they're not an entertainment medium. They're not. They're an umbrella term for multiple entertainment mediums. Everything we think of as a gaming genre isn't a genre. It's a medium in its own right. Every single one. There may be crossover points where they're blending because these are such young mediums of entertainment. They're all experimental mediums. Video games is experimental art forms. It is a collective name for a collection of experimental mediums of art, each their own variation of an interactive medium of art. All of them potentially having different genres. So, a good example of that would be the open world game. An open world game is a particular style of interactive game. We know what we're expecting with an open world game, but you can have an open world game that is a superhero game, and that would be something like Marvel's Spider-Man. or even Infamous. That would also be a superhero game. It's not one of the big two, Marvel or DC, but it's still a superhero game. Those would be the same genre and the same entertainment medium, the same category. Now, we don't have a name for this. We don't have a name for this category. We might need to name this category, because video game is up here. There's this new category, this new thing that this medium of entertainment is in, but we need a name for it. We can't keep saying medium of entertainment. We need a category name for this. And I don't know what to call it yet. But this new category of open world, so open world game, this would include the Spider-Man game, it would include Infamous, but it would also include other open world games, like GTA. GTA would be a crime open world game. Or perhaps you would say contemporary open world game. That would work. Red Dead Redemption would be a Western open world game. Western being a rather niche genre, but definitely a genre in its own right. So now we've got Western, we've got contemporary crime, and we've got superhero. These are genres we recognise. These exist in films and books. But they're all open world games. An open world game is its own thing, separate from other video games. Open world game sits alone. And then we can move away from that and we can go, right, what other categories do we have? What about fighting game? Now, I don't really know much about fighting games. I'm not very good at them. I'm not at a competitive level, but fighting games would include games like Street Fighter, Guilty Gear, Mortal Kombat, Smash Brothers, there's the Soul Calibur series, there's loads more out there. All of these games seem very similar to me. I would not be able to delineate between genre here. I would even argue, do fighting games have their own genres? Are there genres within fighting games? Because I'm not seeing them. I'm not seeing any clear delineation between genres. I'm seeing simply arcade fighting games. Or competitive fighting games. I'm happy with either name for this category. Racing games, that's another one. Racing games definitely have genres. Racing games, you can have sci-fi racing games, something like F-Zero or Wipeout. You could have contemporary racing games, so that would be something along the lines of Gran Turismo or Forza. And you could have cartoon racing games, something like Mario Kart. And we've described them as kart racers in the past, but that's just because Mario Kart was the first one, so that's just naming it after Mario Kart. But that could work. Now, cartoon might not really be a genre, but it's close enough, and we're getting there. What about one of the newest ones, Soulsborne? I've always hated that name. Well, I claim we call that precision action games. I think that's a good name for them, because the whole point behind them is that they're all about being precise, and their focus is on the action. I think they work. It doesn't tell you everything about them, and it's a little difficult to really encapsulate what they are. If someone's got a better name, by all means suggest it. I'm aware Elden Ring makes this extremely difficult, because that would also go in the open world section. But that's the problem with young mediums like this. Young entertainment mediums, they're so experimental that there's crossover. It's hard to really place anything in any one category. So, if we've got games like the Dark Souls series, the Neo series, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, there's plenty in there. So, Bloodborne. these would all be the same genre. I would also include in this things like Control as well. Now, even though it's got shooter elements, even though you're fighting at range, I still think it's got enough in common with all of these other games that it feels like it's the same, not genre, but the same category. Because genre, remember, is the literary and film category that we were using. This is the gameplay category. It's what we called genre in video games before, but we shouldn't say genre because it's confusing. This should all be under the umbrella term of precision action game. Okay, so, what genres are these then? Well, Bloodborne is clearly a horror precision action game. That's easy. And Dark Souls would be a dark fantasy precision action game. We're good so far. Jedi Fallen Order, that would be a space opera precision action game. I think we're all in agreement there. Possibly even space opera fantasy precision action game. Now, I realise this is getting very long. These genre names are getting to be a whole sentence. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that we need this level of detail, this level of categorization for gaming. Because as an interactive medium, we have the interactive element and we have the non-interactive element. There are some games that don't have the non-interactive element, like puzzle games. Tetris doesn't have the non-interactive element. So puzzle games, much like fighting games, maybe they just exist as a single thing. Maybe they just don't need to have genres. They're just an entertainment medium without genre. That's allowed, that can exist. I think this is a conversation worth having, and this is where my brain has taken this so far. I still haven't come up with a unified category for everything, but I'm getting there. And that's what this video is all about. It's me trying to get all of what I've been working on over the last few years, really, with genre and categorization, and putting it all in one place. Because I've been discussing this in Gilded. You're welcome to join us in Gilded over the last couple of days, primarily talking about anime, and this has really got me thinking about how categorizing entertainment media is really difficult. There are so many different mediums of art that are difficult to categorize, so many different forms and so many different intricacies that we need to consider in order to properly categorize everything. And I think in order for genres to be useful, we need to actually have a proper defined boundary for them. But we also need to accept that genres are not bound things. They don't have properly defined boundaries, which makes them self-contradictory. It's really difficult, but I'm hoping that we can get there and make them useful. I think my intention is that by the end of this, I can come up with something that would be a good descriptor that I could put this into, I don't know, maybe a short book where I could describe each of these genres, and by the end of it, every single person who read that would be on the same page and know exactly what each other's talking about. And I want to try and keep it as close to what the current standard is, so that there's still a level of interconnection. There's no point redefining everything. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. We already have the words first-person shooter. So let's keep that. Let's keep defining a first-person shooter as a first-person shooter if we can. Is there a reason the first-person shooter needs to be defined by its camera perspective? I think there is. I think the camera perspective actually is directly influencing the gameplay. So I think first-person shooter is a good descriptor. Do we need to have the camera perspective in every descriptor? No. I don't think we need third-person in precision action. We don't need third-person precision action. Is there a risk that someone's going to start making Dark Souls style combat in first person, and that's going to suddenly take off? Maybe. And if that happens, we're going to have to come back to this and we're going to have to recategorize again. And that's going to be annoying. But right now, it's not a thing. Or if it is a thing, it's so niche that it doesn't really need its own genre. That's what I think. That's where I think we're at the moment. So I'm going to come up with my own table of genres and categories across different mediums, and I'm going to see what I can come up with, and I'm going to put it out publicly, and I want to see what you guys think. So if that sounds like it'd be interesting to you, come and join us on Gilded. Let's chat through, and check out the rest of this channel. I'll be updating you when I finally got this out, and I want to see if people disagree. I want to be able to discuss this through, and maybe if there's a few areas where I haven't got it quite right, or I've made a couple of little errors, or if there's a few points where you feel I'm being a bit, I've got it a bit wrong, or there's a few contentions, you can call me out on them, and we can go back and we can hash it out. That sounds great to me. But the struggle, I think, there's a constant struggle in video games, is the genre just doesn't fit. I don't think genre fully fits with TV or with books or with anime or with music or with anything else for that matter. But it definitely doesn't fit for video games. And that's what I've got to say on that. Thanks for listening. It's been interesting. And I'll talk to you about this soon. Bye.